Welcome to the road mapping videos. It's going to be in 4 parts. This is actually more to do with strategy than anything else. So these videos, you're going to learn how commitments are broken down. You're going to learn how 5-year roadmaps are created, and there's 2 different methodologies for doing so. And in this video, you're going to learn how to understand strategic priority decision making. So how do you prioritize all the different things that are coming up to balance the sustainability priorities with business. So without further ado, let's kick off. So there are 5 considerations for the strategic considerations. We have regulatory market conditions, strategic context and leadership intent. So what was your original planning, or what was your vision for the company? User customer feedback, team feedback, those 2 are pretty straightforward. And resources that are going to be needed. I believe that's also straightforward. So we're just going to dive into this right away with the regulatory market conditions. Now these are in order. This comes first because even if you have a great vision, you still need to look at what is happening in the market. So with a very real example, there is a medium-sized firm in Canterbury that reached out to us for some help, and they sell to a big company that operates pretty much everywhere. And because they're part of that supply chain, they had to start reporting their emissions, and even an SBTI, which is a Science-Based Target Initiative approved plan, every year with evidence of improvement, or risk losing all future tenders with their biggest customer. So in this instance, no matter what vision that you have for the things that you produce, you're going to get completely stumped if your biggest customers say, well, these are the things that have to change, or else you have no business, you have no vision. So it doesn't matter what strategic concept or what leadership wants to do. You have to make certain changes. So that's one of the first key priorities, is to understand the context of what your customers and what the market is doing, especially when it comes to regulation. Number 2 is strategic context and leadership intent. Now, this is about aligning with what leadership is already thinking, because your future plans, your budget, and time can get completely thrown when you're working in sustainability matters. So do this by nurturing these relationships, the leadership relationships that you have. And if you're stuck, you can ask help from your colleagues, your boss, or get a coach to learn how to nurture relationships with your board, with your CEO, and top-level decision makers in your company, because they're the ones who are ultimately going to tell you where to go. So if you're creating the sustainability plan, of course you have to get that context from your board and your leaders. And the third consideration for developing your sustainability strategy and your work and road mapping in it is your user and customer feedback. So you might have clients, you're also considering their customers in this as well. Now this one is interesting because the complexity is about mediating the different levels of educated thoughts and feelings of your customers, because we're starting to get, especially in Western countries, more and more polarization. So it's become more complex, and everyone has valid thoughts. And some will be vocal about what they see in their community, and it's not directly related to your core business. So you might be a bank, and then customers might say, well, what about all this plastic that we have in our communities? You got to do something. You're a big bank, you got lots of money. And they say, well, that's not directly a consequence of our business operations. It's indirectly, sure. But if you go along that route, almost any issue that's created from funds that have come from even said bank will be their problem. And this is essentially what is happening in the EU with the CSDD or CSDDD, which is about due diligence for large companies, and for them to due diligence on the effect and the impact of their company and said communities. So this is now a growing trend. So other customers are going to be more aware and drive a hard point on things that are directly related. So like what I just mentioned with the CSDD. So your messaging around this topic has to reflect that. So we'll dive into that into the influence section of the videos. Now what you need to do here is to apply empathy, and you do that by applying all the tools that you have in your customer understanding toolbox, which we're not going to dive into this because that's certainly one of the business leaning aspects. So for example, there's 4 areas that we look at. That's more curious conversations, right? So when you ask them what's important, you ask them how important it is. What about that is about? What makes it important? What does important even look like to you? And that involves a lot of listening, very little talking, and certainly no yelling. And secondly, customer surveys, focus groups, observations. So those are some of the things that you should be doing to win in your customer feedback activities. And next up, we have the team feedback. Now, this one is just like the customer feedback one, same sort of tools, listening, interviews, except the risk of customers not aligning with you and not buying with you is swapped with initiatives being coordinated, planned, and executed poorly. And from our experience, you'll also be really surprised about the good potential that can come from here. Once I was invited to a 6 a.m. toolbox for a construction company, and that's a weekly meeting with like 60 blue-collar truck drivers and skilled laborers, where they got together for their operational meeting over breakfast and drinks, and that's where people didn't know what a toolbox was. So their national head of sustainability and another senior leader were convinced there was going to be a ton of resistance, so I had a whole communication strategy planned. I had prizes even. I didn't use any of it. And they had insightful, tough questions, and all they wanted was the truth. So I told them what I knew, what I didn't know, but where I knew where I could get that data reliably. And then later they ended up organizing themselves, which was quite interesting because it certainly wasn't what senior leadership was expecting. So what changed on the team feedback aspect? So the first one was they actually spoke about it. That was their first meeting when they actually had the sustainability as the core topic of their toolbox. So essentially they just got started. Number two, the approach wasn't a top-down, I'm the expert, hear me talk. It was a, tell me what you're thinking so I can meet you where you are and align with that, with where we want to be. So meeting each other in the middle, or meeting them where they are really, and then bringing them towards the middle. And I ended up not using any of the slides that I prepared. And number five is resources needed. Simply put, what do you have now? And it'll guide you pretty quickly on what to start with and where you're going to take on key activities to build those resources. However, the insight here is that it's about resourcefulness and relationship. So once you've defined those things that you need and where you're short, turn to your partners and community, and that's assuming that you've nurtured those relationships, in order to execute your plan without the risk of failure because you simply didn't invest the right amount because you thought you couldn't, you thought you didn't have those resources. So this is where turning to your partners and being incredibly creative with your resources and what you can get is key. So those are the 5 considerations that we look to when building your strategy, building your roadmap, and prioritizing all the different things that are going to be inevitably coming up when you start your sustainability strategy.